You know, there's this quiet but absolutely massive shift happening right now inside Australia's museums. It's a total rethink of how we see, how we handle, and how we understand Indigenous heritage. And to really get our heads around it, we first have to go way, way back, like 2,000 years back, to a fascinating misunderstanding between two ancient empires. So picture this. The ancient Parthian Empire sends its royal kids over to Rome. Now, for the Romans, this was a no-brainer. These were hostages. It was a clear sign of submission, a symbol of their dominance. But here's the thing. The Parthians saw it completely differently. For them, it was something called fosterage, a way to build a kind of political family with the Roman emperor playing this sort of protective parental role. So you have two worldviews, looking at the exact same act and seeing two totally different realities. And that, right there, brings us crashing into modern Australia. What if our own cultural institutions, our museums and galleries, have been accidentally operating under a similar kind of misunderstanding for centuries? A misunderstanding about the very soul of the treasures they hold. Okay, so to really get what's changing now, we've got to hit rewind. We need to look at how museums in Australia historically worked and the very specific, very powerful lens they used to shape our national story. And you really can't separate museum practices from government policy. I mean, it's all connected. From the White Australia policy, which was all about racial exclusivity, to the assimilation era's push for everyone to fit one cultural mold, the whole national project was aimed at creating a single, unified Anglo-Celtic culture. And, well, that had a huge impact on how museums treated anyone and anything that didn't fit that model. Under this, let's call it the colonial gaze, Indigenous cultural material wasn't treated as living heritage. It was framed as static objects or specimens, things to be collected, put in a box, given a label, and displayed, often completely cut off from their living, spiritual context and their deep ancestral meaning. And the legacy of that way of thinking? Well, it's still right there in the data today. A recent report from the Australian Museums and Galleries Association, AMGA, it paints a really stark picture. I mean, think about this. Only about a quarter of these institutions have Indigenous board members. And get this, a mere 13% have a formal policy for how to even interpret Indigenous materials. That's not just a little gap, that's a systemic silence right at the top. So, how in the world do you fix a problem that deep? Well, it doesn't happen with small tweaks here and there. You need a plan, a real systemic response designed to reshape the very foundations of how these places operate. And this is it, the AMOGA 10-year Indigenous Roadmap. It's built on 5 big ideas that all work together. It starts with totally reimagining what representation looks like and embedding First Nations values right into the DNA of a museum. Then it's all about people, creating real career paths, building a two-way street for caretaking, and of course, forging deep, real connections with communities. And here's the most important part. This isn't just a bunch of nice ideas on a PowerPoint slide. The roadmap calls for concrete action. Things like creating reconciliation action plans, or RAPs, making cultural competency training mandatory for everyone, prioritizing the return of ancestral remains, and crucially, championing Indigenous leaders and making sure cultural advisors are paid fairly for their expertise. It's a truly practical guide to making change happen. And you know, this isn't just happening in some museum world bubble. Big companies like Deloitte are creating their own RAPs. Major national institutions like the Australian National Maritime Museum are putting Indigenous heritage right at the heart of what they do. It's part of a much, much bigger conversation happening across the country. So all of this change in philosophy, all these new policies, it's led to something very real, very tangible. We are in the middle of a massive billion-dollar investment in new First Nations cultural institutions, an absolute boom. And the scale of this investment is just staggering. We are talking about nation-building levels of commitment here. $250 million for the Tarkari Centre in Adelaide, $80 million for a National Aboriginal Arts Gallery in Alice Springs, $50 million for an Aboriginal Cultural Centre in Perth, This is a cultural boom by any definition. Now, this spending isn't just happening randomly. It's directly tied to the federal government's national cultural policy, which is called REVIVE. And its very first pillar, its number one priority, is First Nations First. That's a huge signal of a national commitment to right the wrongs of the past and to put Indigenous stories right where they belong, at the very heart of Australia's story. But of course, a journey this big is never without its bumps. Big investments spark big debates, and this quote from someone involved in the Adelaide project really shows that tension. They felt the vision was becoming too commercial, saying they couldn't agree with ideas that seemed to revolve around a cafe, a shop. It's a powerful reminder that even with the best intentions, the path forward is really, really complex. So when you pull the camera back and look at the whole picture, the policies, the funding, the new buildings, the debates, it's all driving towards something much deeper. It's about a fundamental shift in perception. It's about changing not just what we do, but how we see. You know, in Northeast Arnhem Land, the Yolngu people have a word for this: Biryan. It describes a shimmer, a sort of brilliant, life-filled light that comes from sacred paintings. It's not just a visual trick. It's an aesthetic of spiritual power. It's the quality that literally brings an object to life. And that right there, that is the ultimate goal: to help everyone involved make that fundamental shift in perception. We're moving away from seeing these inert objects, just items to be cataloged and preserved behind glass, and we're moving towards recognizing living heritage. We're learning to see items that pulse with ancestral connections, that are alive with spirit, an aura, a burion. It's a move from a relationship of ownership to one of genuine connection. So the final question really is for all of us. What happens when we stop looking at a piece of the past as just a thing, and instead we learn to see its shimmer? What new stories and what new connections might we find then?